Howdy, folks. This is Big Sam. Welcome back to another episode of Mosin Markings. And of course, we got a really interesting one for y'all today. Specifically, we're going to be taking a look at this box right here. Nothing in it, just a normal square. And this interesting square can generally be found on refurbished 9130s especially, but also M38 rifles and M44 rifles as well. This is actually a pretty common marking. I'm going to give this one about a 2 out of 10 on the rarity scale. And again, this is going to be typically seen on refurbished World War II rifles that were imported out of the remnants of the Soviet Union. Now, what is this box marking exactly? Well, this marking is, as you might guess, a refurbishment marking. And since we know so many Mosins were refurbished, that kind of automatically makes this a not super rare marking. But there are so many of these markings that it's really important to be able to differentiate each one and figure out their exact meaning, especially in cases when we actually know their meaning, because sometimes we're not so sure. But this one, we do know. Now, before we get into it, I want to mention I'm glad I get to bring y'all this rifle here today, because this is this rifle, and you could probably memorize the serial number so you'll know it in the future when you see it again. This is actually kind of the Mosin that started it all for Big Sam. This was my very first Mosin, so this, of course, holds a special place in my heart. This is a 1942 9130 rifle. Now, this one's interesting because it has this box marking on the barrel shank. And of course, that indicates this rifle was refurbished. But by whom? Well, remember from our last video, we were talking about refurbishments, that there were different refurbishment depots scattered throughout the Soviet Union. And when we look at the modern day countries that used to comprise the Soviet Union, it would actually be scattered across several different modern day countries. Now, this particular marking comes from the very interesting country of Latvia. This marking is indicative of refurbishment arsenal number 7. Okay? Now, how do you remember that number 7 is a square? I just sort of had to memorize it. I'm sure you can find some really clever way. Maybe you can think of square starts with S, 7 starts with S. So maybe you can go with that. Remember, it's important to not get this confused with that other box marking we looked at last time, which actually happens to be on the stock of this rifle. I'm talking about the box that has a slash through it. That's arsenal number 1. Remember, the way I remember that is there's one slash through it for number 1. But anyway, back to our marking here today. Typically, on that previous marking, you'd see it stamped, especially on the stocks. This stamp is almost always on the barrel shank of rifles. And again, you can probably find this on not only 9130 rifles, but also the M38 and M44 carbines. But this really just indicates that the rifle was refurbished, probably was refinished, potentially got a new stock, although this guy got a new stock from a different depot. Now, whether or not it was actually at that depot, that number 1 depot that we saw the marking for on the stock, and that's where it got its stock, or this stock was made by that depot and then shipped to Latvia at depot number 7, not exactly sure. I think more research is required. But whatever the case, it actually is common to see rifles with multiple markings from different depots, or the rifle may have a marking from one depot where the stock itself might have a marking from a different depot. Every Mosin is pretty much unique in that respect, folks. Okay, now, when we see this marking from arsenal number 7, it's also usually accompanied pretty close by another interesting marking. It's actually a circle with crossed hammers through it. And in fact, we see it present on this rifle, although a lot of times it's not very well stamped. And on this rifle, it's kind of hard to see. You have to be really familiar with the marking, but it's this marking right here, okay? So that is another marking from arsenal number 7 in Latvia. And that marking in particular, you can actually find on some other parts, we'll have to do another Mosin marking video another day to look at some other parts that you might come across that bear that mark from Arsenal number 7. But, I really like this marking, even though, like I said, this isn't a particularly rare marking. It's just cool that it comes from Latvia. Now, Latvia is a really interesting country because, contrary to what some people might think, Latvia, like many countries, of course, gained its independence in 1918, but it didn't gain its independence from Russia. It actually gained its independence from Germany. So a little bit different than some other countries we saw after the onset of the Russian Revolution after World War I. So Latvia has an interesting history, especially with Germany, but after that, it has an interesting history with Russia, of course, because it was sort of annexed and overtaken by Russia in 1940, particularly by the Soviet Union in 1940. Not really a good year to be in really Eastern Europe, or really Western Europe for that matter. But at any rate, it was sort of complicated because, again, they broke off from Germany, and then just a little bit later, they got overrun by the Soviet Union, and then ultimately, Latvia would be a part of the Soviet Union post-World War II, all the way up until it gained its independence in 1991. All right, now if you're not familiar with Latvia, it's just right by Estonia, just across the Baltic Sea from Finland, and it's pretty close to modern-day Poland. Now, one of the other really interesting things here, again, is that Latvia in the modern day is kind of totally disjoint from Russia. In fact, Latvia is a member of the European Union as well as a member of NATO. So it's one of those really cool, more modernized countries there you can go to today, and there's a lot of interesting remnants from the Soviet Union, even though they're far more considered to be allies of the West than, modern-day Russia, obviously, because they're a member of NATO. But that's why I wanted to mention that, just because it's interesting that there are some still Eastern European countries that are part of the EU that actually helped bring us Mosins or had an important influence on the history of the Mosin Nagant, certainly in many time eras, but especially during the Cold War era, where they actually helped refurbish a lot of Mosins. So if you ever get the chance to go to Latvia, I recommend it because there's a lot of really interesting remnants of some old school Soviet Union buildings and whatnot. So if you ever see this square marking on a Mosin Nagant barrel shank, that's what it means. It means your rifle was refurbished by Arsenal number 7 in Latvia sometime between the early 1950s and, well, probably the late 1980s or maybe even 1990. Who knows? So I hope you guys learned something today. If you enjoy more videos like this, please stay tuned and make sure to subscribe so you don't miss a Mosin Markings episode. If you guys got any suggestions on what you want to see a video on next for Mosin Markings, if there's a particular marking you're interested in seeing a video on, let me know in the comments or send me an email. I post my email in the description of every video. And last but not least, let me know if y'all got any prayer requests. Thank you guys for watching, and we'll see you next time.